The mahogany-paneled auditorium at Harvard was packed. Scholars, journalists, students, all waiting to witness what they assumed would be a polite, forgettable exchange. The air buzzed with quiet condescension. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his posture firm. He scanned the room, calm but unreadable. A professor leaned into the microphone, voice dripping with academic smugness. "Mr. Traoré," he began, "some here question the legitimacy of your leadership. After all, you're not exactly a product of higher education. More a military man than a statesman, wouldn't you say?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ivy League chuckles, the kind that echo with centuries of gatekeeping. Traoré didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, let the arrogance settle into the walls. Then, with a voice low and deliberate, he spoke. "I did not come here to impress you with degrees. I came to ask why your institution, with $53 billion in wealth, still profits from the suffering of my people." The room froze. He continued, "You call me uneducated. Yet your endowment is invested in mining companies that bleed Africa dry. You teach ethics while funding exploitation. So tell me, who here is truly uneducated?" No one laughed. A student dropped their pen. A journalist stopped typing. The professor blinked, stunned. Traoré's gaze swept the room. "You invited me to speak. So I will speak. Not for applause, but for truth." And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The man they tried to humiliate had just cracked open the polished veneer of Harvard's moral authority. But what Traoré said next didn't just silence the room. It exposed a $53 billion empire built on hypocrisy. Harvard isn't just a university, it's a global symbol. With an endowment of $53.2 billion, it holds more financial power than the GDP of dozens of nations. Its alumni shape policy, its research drives legislation, and its prestige is treated like gospel. For decades, it has positioned itself as the intellectual conscience of the West, progressive, inclusive, enlightened. But behind the ivy-covered walls, a different story simmers. That endowment? It's not just sitting in a vault. It's invested in fossil fuels, in mining conglomerates, in pharmaceutical giants accused of price gouging. And while Harvard lectures the world on ethics, it quietly profits from systems that exploit the very communities it claims to uplift. Recently, federal scrutiny intensified. Reports surfaced of questionable ties to defense contractors and whispers of tax loopholes used to shield billions from public accountability. The cracks in the ivory tower were beginning to show. So when Harvard invited Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old president of Burkina Faso, it wasn't just a guest lecture. It was a test of whether the West could stomach a voice that didn't come wrapped in deference. Traoré wasn't a polished diplomat. He was a revolutionary, a man who rose from the ranks of the military to lead a nation tired of being patronized. His presence was a challenge to the unspoken hierarchy. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? For many in the global South, this moment was electric. It wasn't just Traoré walking into Harvard. It was centuries of silenced voices finally entering the room. The son of Africa, standing before the gatekeepers of Western legitimacy, ready to speak not as a supplicant, but as an equal. And Harvard? It wasn't ready. The institution had expected a ceremonial exchange, a few polite remarks, maybe a photo op. What it got instead was a reckoning. Traoré didn't come to flatter. He came to confront, to peel back the layers of performative progressivism and expose the machinery beneath. He spoke not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation whose resources had been extracted, whose leaders had been dismissed, whose people had been told they were developing while their wealth built empires elsewhere. His words carried the weight of history and the urgency of now. And just when Harvard thought they had the upper hand, Traoré flipped the script. Harvard's reputation gleams like polished marble, the oldest university in America, a sanctuary of intellect, a beacon of progress. Its graduates walk into presidencies, boardrooms, and Supreme Court benches. Its professors shape policy. Its research commands billions in grants. But beneath the prestige lies a darker inheritance, one built not just on knowledge, but on power, privilege, and profit. The university's $53.2 billion endowment is the largest of any academic institution on Earth. It's a financial fortress, shielded by tax exemptions and managed by elite investment firms. But where that money flows tells a different story. Harvard's portfolio includes stakes in mining companies accused of environmental devastation in Africa, pharmaceutical giants embroiled in opioid lawsuits, and fossil fuel conglomerates that lobby against climate reform. It preaches sustainability while profiting from extraction. It teaches ethics while investing in exploitation. And then there's the legacy. Harvard's early benefactors included slave traders and colonial administrators. Its buildings bear the names of men who built fortunes on human suffering. For centuries, it was a gatekeeper, not a gateway, for marginalized communities. Only in recent decades did it begin to diversify, and even then, the change was cosmetic. Diversity brochures, token hires, and curated panels became the norm. But the power structures remained untouched. In 2023, the cracks widened. A federal audit revealed questionable use of research funds tied to defense contracts. Whispers of lobbying influence and opaque financial practices began to circulate. The Department of Education froze certain grants pending investigation. Harvard's image, once untouchable, began to fray. So when the university extended an invitation to Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't just diplomacy. It was optics, a chance to showcase inclusion, a photo op with a young African leader. But the invitation came with an unspoken expectation that Traoré would play the role assigned to him. Grateful guest, humble observer, a man who would nod politely while Harvard basked in its own benevolence. They didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect a man who understood the game and refused to play it. Harvard's arrogance wasn't just in its wealth. It was in its assumption that prestige equals virtue, that a man without a Harvard degree couldn't possibly challenge its authority, that someone from Burkina Faso, a country often ignored in Western discourse, wouldn't dare question the institution's moral compass. But Traoré wasn't there to be impressed. He was there to confront. He saw through the performance, the curated diversity, the rehearsed introductions, the carefully worded questions. He recognized the subtle condescension in the way professors framed their inquiries. He felt the chill of intellectual gatekeeping, the kind that dresses up exclusion in academic language. And he came prepared, because Traoré understood that this wasn't just about him. It was about every leader from the global south who had been patronized, every student who had been silenced, every nation whose resources had been drained while being told they were developing. He knew that Harvard's power wasn't just in its curriculum. It was in its ability to shape narratives, to decide who gets to be the hero and who remains the footnote. So he didn't come to Harvard to be validated. He came to expose. And Harvard, for all its brilliance, didn't see it coming. They saw a uniform. He brought a mirror. They saw a guest. He brought a reckoning. But Traoré wasn't just another guest. He came armed with receipts. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't born into power. He was born into struggle, in a land where foreign corporations mined gold while local children walked barefoot to school. In Burkina Faso, dignity wasn't inherited. It was fought for. And Traoré fought. He joined the military not for prestige, but for purpose. He saw the corruption, the foreign meddling, the puppet leaders who bowed to Paris and Washington while their own people starved. He rose through the ranks quietly, never chasing headlines, only justice. And when the time came, he didn't seize power, he reclaimed it. At just 34, Traoré led a revolution. Not with tanks, but with truth. He spoke to the youth in their language, not the language of colonial textbooks, but the language of pride, of resistance, of possibility. He didn't promise miracles. He promised honesty. And in a continent often caricatured by Western media, he became a symbol of something rare, a leader who didn't flinch. His stance was clear. No more foreign bases. No more IMF strings. No more pretending that aid was anything but leverage. He called out France's lingering grip. He rejected the idea that Africa needed saving. He declared that Burkina Faso would chart its own course, even if it meant walking alone. Western diplomats scoffed. Editorials called him reckless, but the youth called him brother. In the villages, in the cities, in the diaspora, his name became a chant. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. And when Harvard invited him, they expected a man softened by diplomacy. Instead, they got a man sharpened by struggle. He didn't come to be applauded. He came to speak for those who never got the mic. He stood in that auditorium not as a guest, but as a mirror, reflecting back the uncomfortable truth that power doesn't equal virtue. That education without humility is just another form of arrogance. That the West's moral authority is not universal, and certainly not unquestionable. Traoré's calm wasn't weakness. It was discipline. His words weren't rehearsed. They were lived. And when he looked into the eyes of those who had tried to belittle him, he didn't blink, because he knew something they didn't. He knew what it meant to lead without luxury, to serve without applause, to fight for a future that may never be televised, but would be remembered. And that's why his next words hit harder than anyone expected. The air in the auditorium had shifted. What began as a ceremonial lecture was now a battleground of ideologies. A professor from the Kennedy School leaned forward, voice clipped and calculated. "President Traoré," he said, "how do you reconcile your lack of formal education with the complexities of governing a modern democracy?" Another chimed in. "Your rise to power was through military means. Isn't that inherently undemocratic?" The questions weren't just pointed, they were loaded. Each one dripped with the assumption that legitimacy came from degrees, not deeds. That governance was a theory, not a lived reality. That a man from Burkina Faso couldn't possibly grasp the nuances of leadership without Western tutelage. Traoré didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He let the questions pile up like bricks, and then, with quiet precision, began to dismantle them. "I understand your concern," he said, voice steady. "But let me ask you, how many of your graduates have governed a nation under siege? How many have walked through villages where children die of hunger while foreign corporations extract billions from the soil beneath their feet?" The room was silent. "You speak of democracy," he continued. "But in my country, democracy was a mask worn by elites who served foreign interests. I did not overthrow democracy. I overthrew puppetry." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "You speak of education. I respect it. But education without empathy is just arrogance. I may not have your degrees, but I have seen my people bleed. I have buried friends. I have stood in the rain with farmers who asked not for theory, but for justice." The scholars shifted in their seats. Their intellectual armor, forged in lecture halls, was beginning to crack. Traoré leaned in. "You ask how I govern. I govern by listening, not to donors, not to diplomats, but to the people who have been ignored for decades." A student in the back nodded slowly. Another raised their phone, recording. "And if that makes me unqualified in your eyes," Traoré said, "then perhaps your qualifications need rethinking." The tension was no longer academic. It was personal. The room wasn't debating a man. It was confronting its own blind spots. Then came the moment that turned the entire debate upside down. Traoré stood still, letting the tension settle like dust after a storm. The questions had been asked. The assumptions had been laid bare. Now it was his turn. He began slowly, his voice steady, deliberate. "You speak of governance, of legitimacy, of education. But let us speak of wealth." A murmur flickered through the crowd. "Harvard's endowment," he said, "is $53.2 billion. That is more than the GDP of my country, more than the GDP of over 100 nations. And yet, you pay no taxes on it. You call it a nonprofit. But it profits immensely." A professor shifted in their seat. Another scribbled something, then stopped. "You invest in mining companies that operate in West Africa. Companies that extract gold, lithium, and cobalt. Do you know how many of those mines are in Burkina Faso? Do you know how many of them pay fair wages? How many leave behind poisoned rivers and broken communities?" He paused. "Your institution profits from the very instability you claim to study." A gasp. Someone coughed. A student looked up from their phone. "You teach courses on African development. You publish papers on poverty alleviation. But your investments deepen the poverty you claim to fight. You speak of climate justice, while your portfolio includes fossil fuel giants lobbying against environmental reform." He let the silence stretch. "You speak of democracy, but your alumni sit on boards that fund coups. Your think tanks advise governments that destabilize ours. You call me undemocratic, yet your money flows to regimes that silence dissent." A pen clattered to the floor. Traoré didn't flinch. "You ask about my education. I ask about your morality." The room was no longer an auditorium. It was a courtroom, and Harvard was on trial. "You invited me here to speak. So I will speak, not in the language of diplomacy, but in the language of truth." He stepped forward. Your institution has ties to the Sackler family, to hedge funds that profited during the pandemic, to pharmaceutical companies that price insulin out of reach. You teach ethics, but your endowment is a monument to contradiction. A student whispered, "He's not wrong. You say I lack credentials, but I have walked through villages where your mining partners left nothing but dust. I have met mothers who lost children to rivers poisoned by cyanide. I have seen schools crumble while your endowment grew." He paused again. "You call me a dictator, but I was chosen by my people, not by donors. I answer to them, not to foundations, not to lobbyists." The crowd was still. "You speak of freedom, but your institution was built on slavery. Your halls bear the names of men who traded human lives. You've never apologized. You've never paid reparations. You've renamed buildings, but not rebuilt trust." A professor looked down, avoiding his gaze. "You say I am dangerous, but I am dangerous only to hypocrisy." He turned to the students. "You are the future, but you must ask yourselves, what kind of future are you building? One that repeats the past, or one that breaks it?" A student stood up, slowly. Others followed. "You invited me to speak, so I did. And now, I ask you, will you listen?" The room was breathless. Traoré stepped back. "I do not seek your approval. I seek justice." And with that, he ended. No applause, no rebuttal, just silence. A silence that was. The moment Traoré stepped off the stage, the internet ignited. Within minutes, clips of his speech flooded TikTok, Instagram, and X. The hashtag #TraoréTruth surged past 1 million mentions. A 10-second snippet, "You ask about my education. I ask about your morality," became the rallying cry of a generation tired of being talked down to. Memes exploded. One showed Traoré calmly standing while Harvard professors melted like wax figures. Another depicted him holding a mirror to the ivory tower, captioned, "Reflection is overdue." African creators stitched his speech into music videos, spoken word performances, and animated reels. The diaspora lit up with pride. WhatsApp groups buzzed. Telegram channels reposted his quotes in bold, gold letters. In Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Karachi, youth gathered in cafes and classrooms, watching the clip like it was a championship knockout. "He said what we've all wanted to say," one student posted. "He didn't just speak, he roared." Commentators weighed in. A South African journalist called it the most important speech at an American university since Malcolm X. A Caribbean activist tweeted, "Harvard invited a guest." Traoré delivered a verdict. Even celebrities joined the wave. A Grammy-winning rapper posted, "This man just bodied Harvard with facts and dignity. Salute." A Hollywood actor shared the video with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." But it wasn't just praise. It was reckoning. Rival politicians, some who had once dismissed Traoré, now scrambled to align themselves with his message. Editorials shifted tone. Think tanks released statements. A few Harvard faculty members issued quiet apologies, acknowledging the institution's blind spots. And still, the wave grew. In Burkina Faso, murals of Traoré began appearing overnight. One showed him standing tall, surrounded by books and broken chains. In Senegal, a youth-led podcast dedicated an entire episode to dissecting his speech line by line. In France, protests outside former colonial offices chanted his name. But the real impact wasn't online. It was in how people saw power differently. The dust had settled. The auditorium, once brimming with intellectual bravado, now sat in contemplative silence. Traoré didn't bask in the moment. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply stood, a man who had spoken his truth, and let it land where it may. He turned back to the crowd, softer now, but no less resolute. "You tried to measure me by your standards," he said. "But dignity is not something granted by institutions. It is earned through service, through sacrifice, through standing when others kneel." A few heads nodded. The shift was palpable. "In my country," he continued, "we do not have billion-dollar endowments. We have mothers who walk miles for clean water. We have farmers who feed nations but cannot feed their own children. And yet, they carry themselves with more dignity than any title could bestow." He paused. "You see, prestige is inherited. But justice must be built." The words hung in the air like incense, slow and fragrant with truth. "I do not envy your buildings, your rankings, your wealth. I envy nothing. Because I have something you cannot buy, The trust of my people. The kind that is forged in fire, not in lecture halls. A student wiped a tear. Another leaned forward, eyes locked on him. You speak of global leadership, Traoré said. But leadership is not about dominance. It is about service. It is about listening to the voiceless, not silencing them with credentials. He looked toward the professors. You asked me about democracy. Let me tell you, democracy is not a seminar. It is a promise. A promise to protect the weak, to challenge the powerful, and to never confuse comfort with virtue. The room was no longer judging him. It was absorbing him. I came here not to argue, he said, but to remind you that the world is bigger than your syllabus. That truth does not need translation. That dignity does not need permission. A hush fell again. You may forget my name. You may forget this speech. But I ask you not to forget this. The future will not be built in towers. It will be built in trenches. And those who serve, not those who posture, will lead it. He stepped back, letting the silence speak. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, if one man can speak truth to a $53 billion empire, what could you do? Harvard tried to humiliate Ibrahim Traoré, but instead, he exposed their $53 billion empire built on silence, exploitation, and prestige without principle. In a single speech, he shattered the illusion that power belongs only to the polished, the pedigreed, the privileged. He reminded the world that truth doesn't need a podium, it needs courage. This wasn't just a moment. It was a message. To every immigrant, every outsider, every voice that's been told it doesn't belong, Traoré stood for you. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He claimed the mic. And in doing so, he gave us all permission to stand taller, speak louder, and demand better. Because dignity isn't granted. It's lived. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Speak up. Be part of the change. Subscribe for more stories that challenge power and uplift truth. Comment with your thoughts, your fire, your fight. Let the world know that silence is no longer an option. Traoré spoke truth to a $53 billion empire. Now it's your turn.